Well, what was it like from your point of view when you got there
Into the valley or into Afghanistan?
into the valley?
Um, it, it was surreal. We it was an CH-47 Chinook helicopter, which is the big twin rotor helicopter that the army flies. And we'd been sort of, I guess, mentally prepared, and the troops were sort of tactically prepared to for it to be a hot LZ, as they say, to be a landing zone that was under fire as we came off the aircraft. Fortunately, that wasn't the case, and as soon as the helicopter flew away, there was just complete silence, and it was sort of strange because there's basically a battle going on, and that there's been a lot of fighting during the day, but just at that moment, for those few minutes, there was no gunfire. There were nobody visible, no US troops other than the ones that we'd arrived with, and no Al Qaeda fighters visible to us. We weren't wearing, Warren and myself weren't wearing night vision goggles, and so I just remember the sound of the wind, and it just being sort of odd. It was sort of, you're bathed in moonlight and you're on the side of this sort of Afghan valley slash mountain. Um, uh, and it was, wasn't particularly warm either. It was only the night of March 2nd in the foothills of the Hindu Kush, so it was a little chilly, but that's what I remember.
And then you there for 4 days, you said?
I think so, maybe 3 nights. I can't remember.
And you were with these soldiers going, they're doing their job like what like
Yeah, no, actually, their mission was to establish a blocking position right there at the end of that valley, the north end of the valley. They if everything had gone according to plan, um, and as the cliche says, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, right? Uh, they were supposed to have flown in with us, in the middle of the day, that day being the 2nd of March, 2002. But in the end, uh, because of the unexpected resistance, and the Al Qaeda fighters weren't where they were expected to be, and so forth, they uh, and by the way, the special forces element that was coming in from the west got basically driven back, by they lost their morale, and they turned and basically retreated all the way back, uh, to the town of Gardez, which is where they had sort of launched from, and uh, because of all of that, General Hagenbach had um, postponed launching the second wave of the air assault forces until much later that night. So that's why we went in that night.
so what was the 4 day period like for just you
It
being there?
was the the number of memories. All around the valley, we could see airstrikes going in, and hear them. So you would see these sort of orange explosions on different times, and on the side of the valley and up the mountains, um and uh and then we came under fire at different times ourselves from uh RPGs, rocket propelled grenades, I believe a recoilless rifle, um and uh, heavy machine gun fire, so-called Dishka rounds, which is roughly similar to an American 50 cal heavy machine gun. It's a 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun. And mortars. That was the big threat, was Al Qaeda mortars. They had plenty of time to sort of basically zero their mortars in on likely places that the Americans might come, might land, and so we were lucky because the position that we were in was basically a wadi, a dried out sort of riverbed that afforded some protection. It wasn't like sort of being on the flat ground. It was more like being in a fairly wide ditch. And then the troops could dig further into that ditch, if you like, further into that wadi to create sort of fighting positions and basically shelters, which they did. There were, nobody. We were quite lucky, well, very lucky, in that nobody got from the sort of platoons that we were with, nobody got seriously hurt. I don't think. Somebody nearby did get injured. I think caught some shrapnel from one of the indirect fire systems, or maybe from an RPG, and was medevaced out, but not life-threatening injuries. We basically stayed in place. So for the several days that I was there, there wasn't much sort of maneuvering, if you like. Towards the end of the fight, I went back into the valley on the last, I think that what was officially the last day of Operation Anaconda, which was sort of like 2 weeks after, 16 days or something after it had started, with a different unit from 10th Mountain Division. And in that was more of what they called back then, and I think still, SSE, sensitive site exploitation. What that really involved was taking overhead imagery of the valley, identifying. By this point, the Al Qaeda fighters had all withdrawn, virtually all withdrawn, and this was about looking at places that looked like they might be either huts or places where the Al Qaeda guys might have cached munitions or anything else. Obviously, the hope would be documents or computers or something like that, and taking that stuff. And so that was quite an arduous day, night, next day trip, sleeping again in the valley, because we weren't just sitting in a wadi sort of observing things then. I was hiking a fair ways up the highest mountain in the valley with these guys. Even then, I was in my mid-30s then, but and I thought I was in decent shape, and I was able to keep up, but I was definitely more exhausted than the average 19-year-old infantryman that was walking ahead of me or behind me. And on that case, that there was actually some gunfire in that, because very close by, one of actually an actual hut that was thought to contain some supplies for the Al Qaeda fighters. Actually, it was full of sleeping bags. There was a tree with an Al Qaeda fighter underneath it, and he had clearly been too badly wounded to withdraw. and I'm not 100% sure that he was alive when the troops showed up, but somebody saw his boot sticking out from under the tree, one of those sort of kind of a stunted little sort of fir tree or pine tree of some kind, so that the branches came down almost to the ground. You could sort of hide in beside the trunk, if you like, which is what he'd been doing. And several soldiers, as soon as they saw that, realized that was an enemy fighter and sort of opened up on him. He was certainly dead by the end of that, but he might, like I said, I'm not 100% sure he wasn't dead at the start. That became interesting because he had with him some captured gear and weapons from what I was earlier talking about, the story within the story, which was there was this big conventional and special forces, as in Green Beret battle, but inside of that battle there was a joint special operations command mission to establish observation posts along the top, and again in a very complicated series of events that I won't try to walk you through. A Navy SEAL element had come into in the middle of the battle rather than in advance of the battle, like the other teams had who were establishing those observation posts had done, and had come in on helicopters rather than overland, and basically lost one of their personnel, a SEAL called Neil Roberts, who either jumped or fell out, quite more likely, from the helicopter as they were taken under fire trying to establish an observation post right at the very top of this mountain, which was called Takur Ghar. They wanted to get the observation post on the top of Takur Ghar because it dominated the battlefield. The problem was, because it dominated the battlefield, Al Qaeda already had an observation post on the top of it, and they took the helicopter under heavy fire. The helicopter was able just to limp away from that, but badly damaged, but unfortunately, Neil Roberts fell out. There then ensued a very confusing few hours as the JSOC task force headquarters, which was not under the command of General Hagenbeck's headquarters, tried together with General Hagenbeck's headquarters to figure out what was going on, what had happened, where had Roberts fallen out. The same team that Roberts was on caught another helicopter back in, very bravely went back in to try to rescue Roberts, who it turns out was already dead, but they weren't to know that by the time they got to the top of the mountain. They were driven off the mountain by heavy fire and badly wounded, left in controversial circumstances, left one Air Force special operator behind, called John Chapman, and whether they thought he was dead, a lot of evidence now suggests that he wasn't, and that he kept fighting. And anyway, later on, a few hours later, then the Rangers, who were part of the JSOC task force, launched their quick reaction force. Again, not really understanding still what was happening on the top of that mountain. and their helicopter got basically shot down as well. And so, and they then stayed up there fighting for hours, and they took casualties as well, several killed in action. That became known as the Battle of Takagar. It's even today, whatever we're at, almost 22 years later, is still extremely controversial in Joint Special Operations Command, in SEAL Team 6, in Air Force Special Operations, and in the Rangers. A lot of finger pointing happened after that battle. In my book, I tried to get into it, and I've written about it again for the New York Times and for Newsweek. Both John Chapman, the Air Force special operator who people now think was mistakenly left behind, wounded but not dead, by the SEALs who went back in to try to rescue Neil Roberts. Both he and Britt Slabinski, the leader of the SEALs who went back in trying to rescue Roberts, received medals of honor for their roles in that fight. So that was that. We were I was still in the valley when that happened, and when that fight was going on, but we didn't know what it was, mostly because of the two different chains of command for the JSOC task force versus the conventional task force. So the captain that who was commanding the company that I was embedded with wouldn't have known what was going on, and for all I know, might have been under orders not to tell me anyway. But we knew something had happened. We knew some stuff had gone on, because you could hear some of the gun runs going on to try to relieve the pressure on the Rangers at the top, sort of F-18s, I think, or F-15s, making gun runs as opposed to just bombing runs on the top of the mountain. And then when they finally lifted all the remaining Rangers and the casualties off the top of the mountain that night, all of those helicopters flew right over our heads. Other memories from Anaconda, I remember an Apache helicopter flying over my head, firing rockets. That was, I suppose that was pretty cool at the time. Seemed pretty wild. So that was Anaconda. I spent the next couple months doing a lot of interviewing about it while people's memories were fresh, and then the next year or two, really year and a half, working on the book.